I have a question with actually on that. That's a good point that Mukoma makes. Like I think when they do the Malcolm X in Africa, you barely hear anybody talk about Tanzania and Kenya. I actually don't think they include it. They just do Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt. That's usually how that whole narrative is told. But I have a different type of question, which I think some of you have alluded to it, which is this, and I'll just to set it up. So in August 2017. Mahmoud Mamdani was invited to give the T.B. Davy lecture, which is like a lecture about freedom of expression at the University of Cape Town. And at this lecture, this was the first time he had gone back to UCT, when he left. He said, and I'm sort of paraphrasing from what people have summarized what he said, was that he said that African languages have remained folkloric, that they are not the bearer of scientific or scholarly tradition. And then he said there's one noteworthy exception on the African continent, that of Afrikaans.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, and I think this is an interesting point he's trying to make. I'm throwing you a little zinger here. He said it is no exaggeration to say that Afrikaans represents the most successful decolonizing initiative on the African continent. He pointed out that it took half a century of a vast affirmative action program, in other words, state support for Afrikaans, to be lifted from the status of other African languages to the bearer of an intellectual tradition. And I want to point this out to you. Afrikaans have like a book culture, book prizes. It has university departments. It has endowed chairs, right? But again, this is a vast affirmative action program. The great irony, Mamdani sort of ended that part of his speech, was when he said, this success story was not emulated by the government of independent South Africa, because he was in South Africa and he was trying to talk to his South African audience. And he was saying this with reference to how other indigenous languages in South Africa were not lifted to that intellectual status. So this is it's a controversial thing then. This is about state support, state investment in something. Again, from a complicated and soiled, if you want, project. Is there something there or because I heard you, and by the way, in the write-up, they said the audience murmured either interest or like, what? So how do you respond to that point by Mamdani?
So I don't know, myself, I would say, and what I've found working with the Mabatu Kiswahili Prize is that the work of decolonization cannot be left to artists, right? So at some level, you'll have to have governmental intervention. Like there's no going around that, right? So you definitely will have, I don't know, I think in Ghana, they might have had during Nkrumah's time, Department of African Languages, right? Or culture, whatever, the ministry, right, of African languages. But certainly we need a similar thing in countries like Kenya, where you have a department whose role is to support the growth of African languages. There's no, the writer won't do it, right? But then also you'll need buy-in from publishers, writers themselves, and readers. What surprises me the most, okay, maybe not surprising. Well, okay, it's surprising in a way, is that the people who mostly advocate for English, right, are politicians and intellectuals, right? In other words, those who have been educated and gone through the educational system, we're the ones who are always advocating for English. Whether in our own individual capacities or intellectuals, or once we get into the government. Others, musicians. If you're a musician, you sing in your language. You're making a film. You can use your African languages and so on and so forth. I'm sorry to say I agree with Mamdani.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is, of course, African states should be supporting the development of all kinds of things in African local languages, right? Not just literatures, but education and many things, the study of the language. But the Mamdani example is weird only because Afrikaans was given the kind of the power that it has through this apartheid state, which had so much wealth by the exploitation of 85% of its population, right? And the complete dispossession of those people. And and post-independent African nations are not engaged in such exactly the same kinds of acts. I mean, we can debate country to country how the government is treating its population, but certainly it's not structured in the same way that apartheid was structured. And so that wealth is what enabled them to fund Afrikaans. And so it's about the distribution of resources and whether or not African states have the same amount of money to spend on such a small percentage of its large population.
Just before Bhakti answers or responds, I just want to point out, within Afrikaans, of course, let's say the project, let's say it was like a Creole Afrikaans. There was no apartheid, and it was this kind of the sort of some like Suriname, like the language of, like, I don't know, the Antilles. It was that kind of, or it was Haitian Pidgin or something, that equivalent, and it was not a regime, as I said, soiled by apartheid. Then it becomes an interesting. But as a principle, the idea that the only way that you can undo the inequality between languages, you cannot rely on a private sector. You can't rely on the corporate university. You have to, the state has to get involved to push that language, to make that the language of the courts. Not just teaching it, but it has to be the language of the courts. It has to be the language of intellectual debate. It has to be on TV. Otherwise, it's not going to succeed. And like Mokoma was sort of saying, you're still just going to have like African intellectuals speaking to each other in English, not just like the globe, not just on a continental level, but within their states, and leaving tons of people out of like the public discourse around, like, what is the country now, or what is the future of this place.
So
yeah.
No, I agree with everything everyone said. Hey, Sean. No, I was just saying, it makes me think of India, because we are forcibly trilingual there at all times. For those who can afford an English education, you always have to afford it. You have to also have Hindi and whatever is the language of the state, and a lot of culture, TV, all of that. I mean, there's a lot of forcing certain languages as a national issue that keeps happening. So, the model that Mamdani is talking about is in the end the right model. The problem is that it's Afrikaans, which comes with a very fraught history, I guess. So.
Yeah. So and what is interesting about English itself is that English used to be treated like an African language in England itself, right? So it's not until in the beginning, English was seen as a vulgar language. It was seen as a language for peasants, right? It's actually not until state intervention, and this was because in the 13th, 14th century, the British realized it's sort of silly to be fighting the French and others using their language, right? So they needed a national identity. So English was picked up and cleaned up, and standardized and so on and so forth. So actually, the irony is that the growth of English itself has the best instruction for African language. Yeah, I mean that. So and then of course, when English came to the continent through colonization, it did to African languages what was done to it, right? So it's the African languages that became vulgar. The African languages could not carry culture. They couldn't carry science and so on and so forth. There's a term I use in my book from Adam Beach, another literary critic. He uses the term the English metaphysical empire, right? To capture what imperial English then wanted to do to the rest of the world, which is to, become the standard of aesthetics, the standard the standard of beauty, whether in literature or in science and so on and so forth. But English itself, it had to go through that battle.
Mm-hmm.